A year ago, the Premier and I stood in this place to deliver our view of the state of the state. The first case of COVID-19 in Tasmania had only just been confirmed, and there was little warning of the upheaval that was to come. So much has changed in those 12 months. Our health system was stretched to the absolute limit, and sadly 13 people lost their lives, and others who were infected with the virus are still suffering after effects today. Structural weaknesses in our economy were exposed, and at the height of the pandemic, nearly 20,000 Tasmanians lost their jobs, and the jobs recovery is incredibly uneven across industries and regions still to this day. The pandemic reinforced the importance of the highest quality public services. Whether it was teachers in our schools adapting to home learning, health professionals, police and emergency services and cleaners, everybody played their part to keep the community safe. We saw the innovation of individual businesses to adapt and survive. And Tasmania is now enjoying the freedoms that many in the rest of the world can only dream about. But that does not mean that the job of government is done. Madam Deputy Speaker, for too long Tasmanians have been conditioned to accept mediocrity. We have been desensitised to having the worst outcomes in health and education in the country. Intergenerational poverty and regional disadvantage have been normalised and put in the policy too hard basket. I've said many times before that we should not rush to return to normal after the pandemic. Returning to normal means returning to mediocrity, returning to the social and economic outcomes that are the worst in the country. And sadly, I fear that is exactly what is happening. While Peter Gutwein, the Premier, claims that the state is recovering, his version of recovery is entrenching and in many cases worsening inequality and disadvantage in our community. The most recent report on government services found that 52% of Category 1 patients for surgery wait more than the recommended 30 days, up from 16.1% in 2015. Ambulance response times are up 32% since 2014, when the Liberals came to power. There are 86% more people waiting to see a health specialist than when the Liberals got into government. The outpatient waiting list numbers are more than 40,000 people, up by about 10,000 people since the Liberals came to office. 3,594 people are on the public housing waiting list, up 65%. The Premier wants to return to normal because that's where his government has always felt safe, but it's not a place where all Tasmanians are doing well. For nearly 8 years now, Tasmania has a government that is committed to defending the status quo. In the words of respected economist Saul Eslake, the Liberals have been minding the store. The trouble is, Tasmanians need more than what this government is selling. While many other things have changed in the past year, sadly, it is Tasmania's most stubborn challenges that remain the same. The Premier cannot wash his hands of these issues. He cannot pass off the blame for the consequences of the cuts that he made as Treasurer. And as good as the government's management of the pandemic has been, it cannot be used as an excuse for the failure to make the lives of Tasmanians better by working hard to uphold the many other responsibilities the government has. Madam Deputy Speaker, the PESRAC report released yesterday is a good start. I commend the members of the Council and particularly the work that they've done consulting with a broad cross-section of the community. The PESRAC process is an opportunity for a step change in the priorities of government and the way the public services are delivered. But it is clear that is not the approach the Premier has decided to take. He's quite happy to continue on the road he's always been on, and sadly, we know too well where that leads. Peter Gutwein may have committed to implement all of the report's recommendations, but we've heard a lot of promises from this government and this Premier over the past 7 years. The Liberals promised to fix Tasmania's health system. They promised to address traffic congestion in our cities. They promised to deliver more affordable housing. They promised to improve the delivery of mental health services. They promised not to introduce new taxes for Tasmanians. They promised to be more transparent and more accountable. And ultimately, actions from this Premier will speak much louder than words. Madam Deputy Speaker, I am not prepared to settle for mediocrity. A recovery that ignores the very real problems of our health system, the rapidly worsening house crisis and spiralling rates of regional unemployment is no recovery at all. Labor's focus between now and the election is holding the government to account for its broken promises to address these challenges and to articulate our plan to use the aftermath of this pandemic as an opportunity to build a better and more inclusive Tasmania. Madam Deputy Speaker, there is no higher priority right now than getting people back into work and giving young Tasmanians the skills they need for the jobs of the future. Peter Gutwin's only measure of jobs recovery is returning to the way things were before the pandemic, which is selling Tasmania short. He wants to celebrate a participation rate that is the lowest in the country, the highest rates of underemployment in the country, and rampant casualisation. Wages are now nearly $12,000 a year below the national average, with no growth over the past 6 months. And the wage gap is growing. It's now nearly $1,000 more than when the Liberals were elected. A regional breakdown of jobs data shows that Tasmania's economic recovery is highly uneven and outside Hobart, much weaker than the rest of Australia. The unemployment rate on the west and northwest coast is 8.3%. It's 7.9% in the southeast, and it's 7.1% in Launceston and the northeast. Whatever the Premier says about jobs coming back, it's clear that regional Tasmania is being left behind by this government. Peter Gutwin is not on the side of these people who are struggling to find work in the aftermath of the pandemic. He does not support meaningful increases in the job seeker payment to lift Tasmanians out of poverty, instead repeating Scott Morrison's claim, not backed by any evidence, that job seeker is stopping people looking for work. In actual fact, there are still 14 job seekers for every job vacancy in Tasmania. Peter Gutwin has refused to lobby for an extension to JobKeeper, even in the face of warnings from the tourism industry that 9,000 jobs could be under threat when the wage supplement is withdrawn at the end of this month. Labor doesn't want to return to the normal. We believe things can be better. Only Labor has a fully costed jobs plan that will deliver 35,000 jobs across all regions and sectors of the Tasmanian economy. We will mandate that at least 20% of workers on all government projects are apprentices, including civil construction works. We will give older Tasmanians greater opportunities to get a trade through our second chance career scheme that covers the increased costs of employing a mature age apprentice. We will fund a climate action workforce to protect communities from the effects of a changing climate, including flood, erosion and fire mitigation. And we will embed career education back in classrooms so Tasmanian students are guided in their career choices. Unlike the government, Labor will not just sit back and hope that jobs return. We'll partner with businesses to drive innovation and create jobs. Our $55 million Tasmanian Jobs and Innovation Fund will leverage at least $2 of private investment for every public dollar spent to drive innovation in new industries, as well as to allow traditional industries like forestry, mining, aquaculture, manufacturing and agriculture to continue to grow. Madam Deputy Speaker, at the heart of Labor's plan is skills and training. Labor will rebuild TAFE from the ground up by employing more specialty teachers and ensuring that the skills and training system delivers what job seekers and employers need. Our plan to rebuild TAFE includes increasing the TAFE workforce by 20% by attracting new trainers with experience in private and public industry. We will make sure that more Tasmanians can access skills training by delivering more courses in our regions. And of course, we will make TAFE free in areas of known skill shortages, including building and construction, tourism and hospitality, agriculture and aged care and disability care. Ours is a positive plan designed to work with the TAFE workforce to rebuild confidence and pride and restore TAFE to its rightful place as the state's training institution of choice. And Labor has been talking about the need for increased investment in TAFE for years. It's not just some thought bubble like the Premier had overnight. Sadly, rather than responding to calls for increased investment, what we heard yesterday from Peter Gutwin was a declaration of war against TAFE teachers. Just like his vendetta against TasWater, the Premier would prefer to have a fight than actually fix the problems at the heart of skills and training. because that is easier for him than acknowledging the fact that his government has ignored, undermined and underfunded TAFE for the past 7 years. And true to form, the Premier thinks he can bully his way to reform. The Australian Education Union responded to the government's announcement yesterday, calling it a misguided attack on TAFE by the Tasmanian Liberal Party, a slap in the face to teachers and regional communities. They said, and I quote, "Wasting money on a war with teachers and communities that depend on TAFE will delay economic recovery and result in diminished training and education. The government should be investing more, not less, in education, but the proposed model would shift the full cost of education onto students and employers. The government has shown complete ignorance towards students and the needs of industry, while also showing little research and due diligence in the announcement." Unlike the Liberal Party, the Labor Party will always back TAFE. The impact of the Liberals' cuts are plain to see. TAFE enrolments are down 31% since 2014. Less than half of all school leavers are working, studying or doing an apprenticeship. That is down from 80% since the Liberals were elected. And if you have a look at the once proud hospitality training institution Drysdale, you only need to look there to see the Liberals' ideological agenda to undermine public skills training. The tourism and hospitality industry presented a comprehensive proposal to the government to restore Drysdale to its proud and rightful place as the flagship of hospitality training in this state. But the Liberals walked away from the industry's preferred model and left a confusing mess in its place. And that's the fate that awaits the rest of the TAFE system if the Liberals have their way. Madam Deputy Speaker, you can't trust the Liberals with public education. There is now a clear choice between the Labor Party that wants to rebuild TAFE and the Liberal Party that wants to blow it up. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to now talk about another key issue for Tasmanians, and that is housing. Last year, Peter Gutwin made a laudable comment that no one should be homeless in the middle of a pandemic. Sadly, once again, we see the Premier rushing to return to normal, and the impact is seen in the escalating stories of homelessness and the growing public housing waiting list. Stories of people like Crystal, who resorted to pitching a tent on the lawns of Parliament last week to raise attention to her homelessness situation. Crystal still does not have a roof over her head. I'm not sure if you went down to see her, Premier, but you really should have. The Premier has let protections against rent increases and evictions expire, even for those that continue to feel the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. This government has proven incapable of fixing the housing problem. Peter Gutwin is not on the side of renters and young people struggling to get into the housing market. He disputes that rents are out of control, in spite of all of the evidence, and the problem stems back to his government's failure to build enough social housing. He is either out of touch with reality or he doesn't care, Madam Deputy Speaker. Meanwhile, the Housing Minister, Roger Yent, has given up trying to clear the public housing waiting list, claiming, and I quote, "We're not in charge of all the circumstances that drive people to social housing." What an extraordinary comment to make. Record high waiting lists are a policy choice of this government. Poverty drives people into social housing, Madam Deputy Speaker, like the job seeker and the job keeper cuts championed by the Premier. Unemployment and job insecurity drives people into social housing. A lack of access to healthcare drives people into social housing. These are all things well in the control of government, and the government that actually wants to do something about them. But that's not this government. Instead, this government settles for mediocrity, excuses and endless promises with no delivery. Ultimately, the government needs to acknowledge that everyone deserves access to have a roof over their head and feel safe, no matter what their circumstances. House prices in our major cities are now amongst the highest in the country. Our rents are more unaffordable than Sydney and Melbourne, but Tasmanians earn $450 a pay less than the national average. Council to Homeless Persons has found that people on JobSeeker in southern Tasmania will be paying 97% of their income on a two-bedroom rental property. In the north and the northwest, it is barely any better, with job seekers forced into situations where 79% and 65% respectively of their income goes on rent. The lack of affordable housing and the rapidly rising cost of housing are having a significant impact on the Tasmanian way of life. In the past, governments have tried to justify Tasmania's lower wages by arguing that house prices and the cost of living were low compared with other states. That is no longer the case. Thousands of Tasmanians in the rental market are caught in a pincer movement between low wages and high cost of living, which is having an impact on their quality of life. Of course, the best thing the government can do to reduce the record high waiting list is to build more houses. Yet in budget estimates last year, Roger Jensch, the Minister...
Yeah, the Honourable, we will use correct titles.
The Minister for Housing confirmed that the overall stock of social housing had increased by just 5 homes in a year.
5.
He also admitted that he'd failed to build a single home with the Commonwealth Housing Debt Waiver funding, despite promising an additional 80 homes a year. It is also the official policy of this uncaring government to discourage people from even applying for public housing, instead telling them to rely on the charity of friends and family. And when the goodwill runs out, as it inevitably does, people are sleeping in tents and caravans and cars and garages and sheds, or even on the streets. The government has ignored the 61 recommendations of the Housing Affordability Select Committee, which was based on broad consultation with experts and stakeholder groups and achieved tripartisan support. And they refused to regulate the short stay accommodation to relieve the pressures in the private rental market. Only Labor can be trusted to build more houses. We did it in government and we have the policies to do it again. Madam Deputy Speaker, Labor's Housing Works policy will fast-track the construction of 490 additional houses in 3 years in partnership with community housing providers. Housing Works will help an estimated 1,100 people into new homes at below market rent. This policy will create more than 550 jobs, 75 apprenticeships and inject more than $300 million into the Tasmanian economy. These 75 apprentices will benefit from Labor's free TAFE policy that will help them get a foot in the door on a job site across Tasmania. We will put a temporary pause on new listings of whole dwellings for short-term accommodation in areas of high housing stress. And we will work to action the 61 recommendations of the Housing Inquiry that the Premier has ignored. Madam Deputy Speaker, Labor will always stand up for the battler, and there is no more important priority than making sure that people have a roof over their head. Madam Deputy Speaker, during the pandemic, our health workforce went above and beyond the call of duty to keep the community safe, even when it came at the expense of their own health, and we saw that during the North West outbreak. For Tasmania's health system, a return to normal has meant a return to ambulance ramping that is the worst in the country. It has meant a return to wait times for elective surgery that are the worst they've ever been, and tragically, it will mean more people die when these deaths could have been avoided. Peter Gutman wants people to forget that as Treasurer since 2014, he has been the architect of the problems confronting the Tasmanian health system. In his first budget, he cut $210 million out of health, and it took a global pandemic for him to finally abandon the almost $100 million in additional cuts announced in the 2019 budget. The consequences of Peter Gutman, the Treasurer and Premier's cuts are plain to see. 7 years of abysmal Liberal failures have left our health system on life support. For years, the government has papered over the cracks, treating health like a public relations problem to be managed only when it becomes too loud to ignore. It's a cynical approach to health and a national disgrace. Tasmanians are waiting for ambulance for hours, not minutes. Patients are languishing in emergency departments on the floor or tucked away in cupboards with a bell to call for assistance because there aren't enough beds. Patients are dying while they're waiting on waiting lists. Patients are dying while they're waiting for an ambulance. They don't seem to matter to a Liberal government that increasingly relies on spin doctors, not real doctors, to run our health system. With each Band-Aid, the structural problems have gotten worse and the health workforce has become more disillusioned. Health professionals are burning out. They have little support for keeping vulnerable Tasmanians safe, and this government does not seem to understand that healthcare is actually being delivered by real people, nurses, and paramedics and medical practitioners. This government is exploiting the goodwill of many, and it is vulnerable Tasmanians who are suffering the consequences. Accepting these failures is a policy choice of the Premier. It is not, however, an outcome that the Labor Party is willing to accept. The grand promises made by the Liberals at the last election have been broken by this Premier and Treasurer who has only delivered cuts and disappointment. The promises to make Tasmania the healthiest state in the country by 2025 has been abandoned because it will never be achieved under the policies of this government. There's been little progress on the promised infrastructure projects like the new Burnie ambulance station, additional mental health beds that have not been delivered. The redevelopment of Ward 4K in Launceston has been constantly delayed. And unfortunately, COVID-19 has highlighted what we've known for far too long, that Tasmania's health system is at a crisis point and Tasmanians are not getting the care that they need and they deserve. As the devastating northwest COVID outbreak demonstrated, regional Tasmanians and our regional health systems are particularly vulnerable, with numerous challenges compounded by our ageing population, poorer health outcomes and limited public transport. The government can't even get the basics right in health, Madam Deputy Speaker. The recently announced Legislative Council inquiry into rural health is a long overdue step in the right direction, which we hope will lead to improved health outcomes and access to community health and hospital services in rural and remote parts of Tasmania. Labor's jobs plan will reduce reliance on expensive locums by converting long-term contract positions in the public service to permanent jobs, including full-time positions where appropriate. Permanent jobs in the health service result in better continuity of care, which leads to better health outcomes for all Tasmanians. We will put mental health workers in all schools to ensure that the mental health needs of young Tasmanians are supported from an early age. And I look forward to releasing more policies in the months ahead that keep people out of hospital and cared for in the community. Madam Deputy Speaker, this government has banked Tasmania's economic and jobs recovery on building infrastructure. But there is no escaping the fact that this government can't build anything. The most recent budget update confirms the government's infrastructure program, the centrepiece of its economic recovery plan, is simply not being delivered as promised. Just $205 million of the more than $1 billion allocated has been expended in the first 6 months of the year, allowing for the fact that in previous years 60% of infrastructure spending has fallen in the second half of the year. The government is currently on track to underspend its infrastructure budget by nearly $600 million. What this government lacks in delivery, it does make up for in announcements and re-announcements, though, Madam Deputy Speaker. They are clearly counting on people forgetting about promised progress before that news is recycled again. And there is not a single major infrastructure project that was promised by this government at the last election that has started major construction. And not a single project promised in 2018 that will actually be completed before the next election. Let me just run you through a list to provide examples of this. The underground bus mall, the Northern Suburbs Passenger Rail, Project Marinus and Battery of the Nation, the Bridgewater Bridge, the Northern Prison, the Tamar River Bridge, the 5th lane on Hobart's southern outlet, the duplicated Sorrel Causeways, fixing Launceston's disgraceful sewerage problem, the duplication of the Charles Street Bridge and the Cradle Mountain Cableway. And that's not an exhaustive list, Madam Deputy Speaker. Nothing quite sums up the government's inability to deliver infrastructure like Peter Gutwin and Michael Ferguson's farcical handling of the Spirits of Tasmania ship replacement. This ridiculous episode calls into question the Premier's judgment and amounts to a monumental broken promise that will cost hundreds of jobs and millions of dollars. This Liberal promise, the promise to build the ships and have them on the run by the end of this year, is a massive broken promise. Instead, 9 months ago, the Premier ignored TT Lyons' expert advice and tore up the contract with RMC. That decision created uncertainty in the tourism and freight sectors, who were banking on increased capacity. And for what, Madam Deputy Speaker? We are right back to square one, with the ships to be built in Finland but delivered at least 2 years after they were originally promised. The promise that the new ships will be built in Australia has been exposed as a cruel jobs hoax. Ultimately, no one wins as a result of the government's bungling and incompetence. The delay will put a handbrake on job creation and investment in the tourism and freight sectors, and the cost of the new ships will almost certainly blow out. That's money that could have been spent directly in Tasmania, creating Tasmanian jobs. And as another reminder of how hopeless this government is at delivering major infrastructure projects, there was more money announced for Macquarie Point in yesterday's State of the State address, with little detail of how that $77 million will be spent. What we do know is that in a saga comparable to an episode of Utopia, what we have seen is the failed Minister for Infrastructure, Michael Ferguson, heralding the opening of a new driveway, only for that driveway to be closed off immediately after the photo opportunity. The bike path, built through the site just a few years ago, that has been closed and ripped up. And the sewage treatment works plant that Peter Gutwein promised to remove years ago, that still stands as a literal repellent to investment. When Peter Gutwein, the Premier, says he has a plan to build his way to recovery, but he can't build anything, it means he doesn't actually have a plan, Madam Deputy Speaker. You can't build infrastructure out of press releases and consultants' reports. It takes more than a few photo ops and hard hats. It takes hard work. And this government has proven that it just hasn't got the chigger for it. Madam Deputy Speaker, Labor can build. We proved that over our 16 years in government. In energy, we delivered Basslink, we built wind farms, and we piped natural gas across the state. Labor delivered the irrigation schemes that have transformed agriculture, supported new industries and created jobs up and down this state. And we delivered the 2 Spirits of Tasmania ferries, which sparked the tourism boom. We built major roads like the Kingston and Brighton bypass, and did much of the planning for upgrades to the Midland Highway before the Liberals even came to power. And Labor's jobs plan will continue that record of delivery, not just announcements like this Liberal government, but delivery. As an island state, Tasmania's Sea Highway across Bass Strait is the most important highway that we have, but has been taken for granted and treated like a political football by the Liberals. Labor would invest $150 million over 4 years to deliver major upgrades to the Burnie, Devonport and Bell Bay ports. These projects would increase efficiencies, put downward pressure on shipping costs and, importantly, create jobs. Peter Gutwein's cuts critically undermine the capacity of state growth to design and deliver infrastructure.
Point of order.
Ooh, touchy.
You have asked the Leader of the Opposition repeatedly to refer to the Premier by his correct title. I ask you to enforce that.
Thank you. I do remind members that we do respect each other across the chamber, and I do ask that members do refer to each other by the titles that we all know are in our standing orders book. So I do ask that you do say that.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I look forward to that being applied consistently throughout all debates. Labor will rebuild permanent capacity within the department to get infrastructure investment back on track, and we will also develop an internship program so design and engineering graduates can gain practical experience in the public and private sector. And we will invest $17.5 million to address the critical maintenance backlog in public housing properties, creating 150 jobs and helping to make sure that Tasmanians can live in warm and safe houses. Madam Deputy Speaker, in the past few weeks, we have seen the deep ideological divide in the Liberal Party exposed for all to see. We have seen an extraordinary war waged by press release to stymie debate on the voluntary assisted dying laws. And make no mistake, the ideological split is not limited to voluntary assisted dying. That was just the issue that brought it to the surface. These are the same fault lines that emerged last January when Peter Gutwein, the Premier, Jeremy Rockcliffe, Deputy Premier, edged out rival leadership team Michael Ferguson, not the Premier, and Elisa Archer, not the Deputy Premier, by a single vote. These divisions feed the Liberal government's policy paralysis, and ultimately they are holding Tasmania back. People might know who Peter Gutwin is, but the weakness of the See, I can't even say what your government is. No one knows who it is. People might know who you are, Premier Peter Gutwin.
I think they might.
But the weakness of the Gutwin government is seen across their benches with no one left to promote, Madam Deputy Speaker, and the rest of you looking pretty tired and bumbling.
Have you looked behind you?
They've run out of ideas of their own, and that was pretty obvious yesterday, Premier, when a number of the announcements that you made were drawn largely from policy that Labor announced last year in our fully costed jobs plan. In contrast to the worn-out Liberals, I am incredibly fortunate to lead a strong, capable and united team. My deputy, Michelle O'Byrne, is a former federal MP and has a wealth of ministerial experience across a range of portfolios in government. You should listen. I know you're jealous because you've got nothing like this team. David O'Byrne, also a former minister, has headed up a national union and worked with respected charity, the Beacon Foundation. I have a former teacher in Josh Willing as a Shadow Minister for Education, a GP in Dr Bastian Seidel as a Shadow Health Minister, a former Mayor in Anita Dow as a Local Government and Planning Shadow, an agricultural scientist in Dr Shane Broad as the Primary Industry Shadow, Alison Standen, the former head of the Smith family and State Manager of the Department of Social Services as a Human Services Shadow, a lawyer in Ella Haddad as the Shadow Attorney General. Jen Butler brings her strong community connection and human resources management to the police, fire and emergency management portfolio. Sarah Lovell, a former union organiser, is our workplace relations shadow. Joe Seeker and Jennifer Houston bring community sector and peak body experience to the table. And Craig Farrell has earned respect across the political spectrum as a fair and principled President of the Legislative Council. Every single member of my team is passionate about their communities, committed to making a difference and absolutely locked in to running for the next election, Madam Deputy Speaker. Labor has a shared vision of the place we want Tasmania to be. We want Tasmania to be a better and a fairer place for everyone. Realising that vision requires a government that is willing to admit that there are still far too many people who've been left behind. It requires a government that is prepared to acknowledge that the magnitude of the challenges ahead of us to close this gap are huge. And it requires a government that is not prepared to accept mediocrity. Right now, Tasmania is at a crossroads, Madam Deputy Speaker. We can choose to return to normal in the full knowledge that normal wasn't great for thousands of Tasmanians. Or we can choose to grasp this once-in-a-generation opportunity to make Tasmania a stronger and a more inclusive place. I know that my team has the talent, the drive and the deep commitment to make the important decisions for our state that will make it a better and a fairer place. We have a comprehensive plan to create jobs and to support our state's economic and social recovery from the impacts of the pandemic. We have the energy and the ability to deliver on our promises, unlike the Liberals. Because the truth is, Madam Deputy Speaker, Tasmanians deserve better than what they're currently getting from the Gutwin government. Every Tasmanian deserves a good education, a roof over their head and access to healthcare when they need it. Every Tasmanian deserves the opportunity to gain the skills that they need and get a foot in the door to get a good job. And every Tasmanian deserves a government that cares about them. The Labor Party will work incredibly hard, Madam Deputy Speaker, to be that government. I am under no illusion as to how difficult and how important the next 12 months will be, but I've got to tell you that I've never wanted anything as bad as I want Labor to win the next election. Because after nearly 8 years under a Liberal government, I see there are far too many people that are getting left behind and far too many important projects that have stalled.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The fact of the matter is this Liberal government doesn't deserve 12 years. You simply don't. And that's why my Labor team will work as hard as we can to demonstrate to the Tasmanian community that there is an alternative, because we know that Tasmania can be a better and a fairer place. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
Honourable Deputy Premier.